I called my mother 3 times. I called my father twice. I was lying there staring at the hospital ceiling, wondering how someone can feel so alone while surrounded by people. After the 5th call, I stopped trying. Because deep down, I already knew no one was coming. This was the night Elena stopped waiting for her parents to become the people she needed. She was 23 years old, successful on paper, exhausted in reality, and about to discover that the person who loved her most had been carrying a family secret for decades. This is the story of a daughter raised by absence, a grandmother raised by regret, and a truth that had waited 20 years to be spoken. The question is, when the people meant to protect you choose silence, who teaches you what love is supposed to feel like? Elena had spent most of her life learning how to deserve love. Not receive it, deserve it. There was a difference, and she understood that difference before she was old enough to explain it. In her mother's house, affection arrived like a reward handed out after inspection. A perfect report card placed neatly on the dining table might earn a quiet nod. Winning a school debate might bring a short smile before dinner. But comfort, the kind that sat beside you when you were tired, the kind that asked if you were all right without needing proof first, felt like something other children were born into naturally. Their house was beautiful in the way magazine homes often are. White curtains, always washed and pressed. Glass tables without fingerprints. Cushions arranged with sharp precision. Family portraits lined the hallway, everyone smiling with careful posture, as if joy had been scheduled for exactly 4 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon. Visitors complimented Vanessa on how well she kept everything. They called Elena lucky. They admired discipline. No one asked why the silence at dinner felt heavier than conversation. Vanessa believed structure was love. At least that was how she explained it. Every morning began with rules before it began with kindness. Shoes aligned at the door. Beds made tightly enough to impress a nurse. Breakfast served at exactly 7. No elbows on the table. No complaints before school. No tears over small things. Vanessa did not yell often. She did not need to. Her disappointment carried enough authority on its own. She could peel an orange at the kitchen counter and make a child feel guilty with one sentence spoken calmly. "You are fortunate," she would say, placing slices neatly into a bowl. Some girls would pray for the life you complain about. So Elena learned not to complain. She learned that sadness looked like ingratitude. That asking for comfort sounded like weakness. That achievement was safer than honesty. By 13, she knew how to apologize before she fully understood what she had done wrong. By 16, she had mastered the art of looking fine. She smiled in school photographs. She thanked people politely. She said she was tired when what she meant was lonely. Her father, Richard, was a gentler mystery. He sat in the same armchair every evening with the newspaper folded into perfect halves, glasses low on his nose, tea cooling untouched beside him. He drove her to piano lessons. He remembered birthdays. He paid school fees early and fixed broken shelves without being asked. He was reliable in the practical ways that make life function. But emotional protection never arrived from him. He did not interrupt when Vanessa's words cut too deep. He did not say, "That is enough." He chose peace the way some people choose religion, consistently, quietly, without questioning what it cost. Sometimes Elena stood in the kitchen doorway watching him read and wondered whether he noticed everything or had simply lived inside silence so long that it no longer sounded unusual. The only place she never felt like she was performing for affection was her grandmother Rose's house. Rose lived 20 minutes away in a small yellow house with chipped paint near the mailbox and jasmine climbing the fence like it had decided to stay forever. Her front porch creaked in familiar places. Her kitchen smelled like cinnamon, old paperbacks, and tea leaves drying near the window. There were unfinished crossword puzzles on the table, flour in places no one bothered to clean immediately, and a radio humming softly near the sink. Rose asked different questions. Not, "Did you finish your assignment?" But, "Are you sleeping well?" Not, "What is your plan after graduation?" But, "What are you afraid of lately?" At Rose's house, Elena did not have to earn warmth. It arrived in chipped floral cups filled with tea, in slices of warm butter cake wrapped carefully in foil for later, in the soft sound of her grandmother humming while watering plants by the kitchen window. If love had a physical address, for Elena, it was that kitchen. Looking back, the first warning looked like nothing. That is the problem with slow exhaustion. It rarely announces itself. It arrives disguised as responsibility, as ambition, as being strong enough to handle Just one more thing. At 23, Elena had just been promoted at a marketing firm downtown. Everyone congratulated her like Survival had won an award. Her office sat on the 12th floor of a glass building where the elevators smelled like expensive perfume and printer ink. She arrived before sunrise most mornings, balancing coffee she forgot to drink in a laptop bag heavy enough to leave marks on her shoulder. Her boss called her dependable. Her coworkers called her organized. She called it normal. Lunch became optional. Sleep became negotiable. Weekends turned into unfinished work disguised as preparation. She answered emails while brushing her teeth, reviewed reports in ride shares, and stared at spreadsheets until numbers followed her into dreams. At night, she sat on the edge of her bed with her shoes still on, apartment lights off, staring at the lamp beside her dresser, as if turning it off required emotional energy she no longer had. She told herself it was temporary. Most people do. Rose noticed first. Grandmothers often do. One Sunday afternoon, Elena sat at the kitchen table turning a spoon slowly through untouched tea. Her lipstick had faded hours earlier. There were dark half-moons under her eyes. Her shoulders looked like they had forgotten how to lower themselves. Rose placed a plate of warm biscuits between them and watched quietly for a full minute before saying anything. "You have been disappearing while sitting right here." Elena laughed, because adults laugh when they are afraid someone has seen too much. She blamed deadlines, promotion pressure, ordinary stress. She used the kind of language high-functioning exhaustion hides inside. Rose nodded, but her hands stayed still around her teacup. Then she said something that would return months later with the force of prophecy. "One day, you will understand why some mothers love from a distance. But distance does not make it hurt less." Elena looked up. There are sentences that feel like closed doors. You sense the room behind them, but something in you chooses not to knock. She did not ask what Rose meant. She changed the subject. And both of them let the silence sit there between the biscuits and the cooling tea. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The collapse happened on a Tuesday, just after 2 in the afternoon. Elena was standing in conference room B, the one with the long glass walls and the table polished so brightly it reflected the ceiling lights. 6 co-workers sat around her with laptops open, coffee cups half finished, and the familiar distracted expressions of people pretending to multitask respectfully. She had been preparing that quarterly presentation for almost 3 weeks. Every number had been checked twice. Every slide had been adjusted until even the spacing between bullet points looked intentional. She was good at things like that. She had built an entire life on being good at things like that. There was a glass pitcher of water on the table beside her. She had not touched it. For the first 10 minutes, her voice was steady, calm, professional. She moved through the financial summary with practiced confidence, clicking the remote in one hand, explaining performance metrics she had memorized so thoroughly they no longer felt like information, only obligation. Then her hands started shaking. At first, she thought it was hunger. She had skipped breakfast again, promising herself she would eat after the meeting. She pressed her fingers harder against the presentation remote and kept talking. But the room changed. The projector light blurred at the edges. Someone's pen tapping against the table began to sound too loud. Her heartbeat arrived all at once, as if her body had suddenly remembered it existed and wanted her to feel every second of it. She blinked. The spreadsheet on the wall tilted slightly. Her manager leaned forward. "Elena, are you all right?" She tried to answer. She really did. But the sentence never arrived. Her knees gave way before embarrassment had time to. The remote slipped from her hand. Papers slid from the edge of the table. A chair scraped sharply backward. Someone stood too quickly. Someone else said her name in a voice that sounded both close and far away. Then there was only the white ceiling above her and the strange humiliation of realizing your body has interrupted the version of yourself you worked so hard to maintain. The ambulance ride felt less dramatic than she expected. Mostly fluorescent lights. Cold questions. A paramedic asking when she had last eaten. Elena trying to calculate whether coffee counted as food, and deciding honesty was easier. At the hospital, everything smelled like disinfectant and tiredness. A nurse clipped a plastic bracelet around her wrist and asked routine questions with the calm efficiency of someone who had seen too many people apologize for collapsing. Name, date of birth, any allergies, emergency contact. That last one made Elena hesitate. Not because she did not know the answer, because she did, and knowing felt heavier than saying it. She gave her mother's number first, then her father's. The nurse typed both into the system without looking up. It felt automatic, like entering an old password your hands remember even when your heart wishes they did not. The doctor was kind. Kindness can feel almost unbearable when you are exhausted. He explained severe stress, dehydration, sleep deprivation, and what looked like a panic episode disguised for months as productivity. He said her body had been asking for help for a long time. He said sometimes people only listen when the body gets loud enough to interrupt them publicly. Elena nodded while staring at the curtain rail near the ceiling. In the next room, someone coughed. Down the hallway, a cart rolled slowly over polished floors. Her phone sat face down on the tray table beside her. She watched the nurse make the calls. She watched her leave. Then she waited. An hour passed. Then another. The daylight outside the hospital window shifted from gray afternoon into the darker blue of early evening. Rain tapped softly against the glass in uneven patterns. Elena checked her phone 3 times, even though she already knew there was nothing to see. No missed call. No message. No, are you okay? Nothing. At first, she told herself there were reasons. Traffic. Meetings. Phones on silent. People get busy. But absence, when repeated enough, stops feeling like circumstance and starts feeling like confirmation. She remembered being 11 years old and standing backstage after a school performance, still wearing the paper crown from a Christmas play, scanning rows of folding chairs for her mother's face. She remembered 16, holding a debate trophy in the passenger seat while Richard drove in silence, and Vanessa asked whether first place would help with scholarships. She remembered every birthday where praise sounded like evaluation. Lying there in the hospital, she realized something painful. This was not a new feeling. It was only a familiar one with brighter lights. The nurse returned just after 6. She had kind eyes and bright earrings shaped like little stars. Elena noticed them because when people are trying not to cry, they often focus on strange details. "We reached your family," the nurse said carefully. Elena sat up slightly. The nurse continued with the kind of practiced gentleness that meant the answer was already disappointing. They said they would see what they could do. There are sentences that sound polite and still break something. Elena smiled. Not because she felt okay, but because dignity sometimes looks like pretending disappointment is not humiliation. She thanked the nurse. She turned her face toward the window, and she watched rain slide down the glass in crooked lines that looked like handwriting no one would ever read. By 7:30, visiting hours were almost over. She had stopped checking her phone. Hope, once embarrassed enough times, learns to sit quietly. She stared at the ceiling and listened to hospital sounds. The low hum of machines, distant footsteps, doors opening and closing, someone laughing too loudly at the nurse's station as if ordinary life had forgotten to lower its voice. That was when the door opened. Elena expected another nurse. Maybe discharge paperwork. Maybe another blood pressure check. Instead, there was Rose. She stood in the doorway, slightly out of breath, cardigan thrown over her nightdress, gray hair pinned unevenly as though she had fixed it while rushing out the door. She was still wearing house slippers, the soft blue ones Elena had bought her 2 Christmases ago. Their edges were darkened by rain. She held her handbag too tightly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Rose looked smaller there under the hospital lights, but somehow stronger too, like love had given structure to a body age kept trying to soften. Then she crossed the room in 3 quick steps. She took Elena's hand with both of hers. Warm, steady, immediate. I came as fast as I could. And that was the moment Elena cried. Not when she collapsed. Not when the doctor explained her body had been asking for help for months. Not when the nurse gently translated parental absence into professional politeness. She cried when someone showed up without needing to be asked twice. Rose sat beside her long after visiting hours ended. She adjusted the thin hospital blanket with the same hands that once tied school shoelaces and wrapped sandwiches in wax paper. She peeled an orange slowly, placing each strip of peel neatly onto a folded napkin. The smell filled the room, clean, familiar, almost domestic against the sterile hospital air. For a while, they talked about ordinary things because ordinary things are often the safest bridge back to breathing. The nurse with the bright earrings. The neighbor whose dog still barked at the mailman every morning. How terrible hospital tea somehow managed to taste both weak and bitter at the same time. Rose made Elena laugh once. A real laugh. Small but enough. But silence, when it has business to finish, always returns. Near midnight, Rose folded the napkin once more and stared at her hands. Her wedding ring caught the overhead light. There is something your mother should have told you years ago. The room changed. Not physically, but emotionally, everything shifted. Even the hallway outside seemed quieter. Elena sat still. There are moments when people sense their life dividing into before and after. This was one of them. Rose spoke slowly, like someone walking barefoot across broken glass. Vanessa had been 19 when she became pregnant. Before that, she had plans arranged neatly like folded clothes, graduate school, travel, a job in another city, a version of adulthood built on movement instead of responsibility. She had been brilliant, restless, and determined not to repeat the small-town life she watched swallow other women whole. Then she fell in love. Or what looked like love when you're 19 and someone promises escape. He was older, charming, the kind of man who made uncertainty sound romantic. When Vanessa told him she was pregnant, he said all the right things first. Then he left, quietly, with promises that sounded kind and meant absolutely nothing. He was gone before Elena was born. No remate gudvie. No final fight. Just absence. And absence, Rose said, can be louder than cruelty. Vanessa stayed. She had no choice. She came home, carrying shame she never named and anger she never learned how to place anywhere except the nearest safe target. That target became motherhood. And later, it became Elena. Rose's voice did not rise as she continued. It stayed steady, almost careful, as though every detail had been rehearsed in silence for years before it was finally allowed to exist out loud. Vanessa did not raise Elena alone in the way people imagine resilience. She raised her inside a life that never stopped reminding her of what she had lost. Every milestone became a reminder of timing gone wrong. Every birthday became a quiet measurement of how different things could have been. The house was always clean, always functional, always ordered. But emotionally, it was filled with something unfinished, like a sentence that never reached its final word. Elena listened without moving. Her hands were folded over the blanket, fingers pressed so tightly together that the skin around her knuckles began to pale. The hospital room felt smaller than before, not because anything physical had changed, but because truth has a way of taking up space that denial once occupied. Even the ticking sound of a distant monitor in the hallway seemed louder now, like time itself had become more aware of what was being spoken. Rose paused briefly and reached for the glass of water on the bedside table. Her hand trembled slightly as she set it down again without drinking. Then she continued. Richard was not Elena's biological father. The words did not land like shock. They landed like recognition, like a door Elena had always walked past without realizing it was hers to open. Rose explained it simply, without decoration. Vanessa had met Richard later, when survival needed structure more than romance. He was steady in a way life had not been. He did not ask too many questions. He did not push against the edges of her past. He simply stayed, and staying in that moment of her life had felt like safety. So Vanessa built a new version of family around stability instead of truth. Richard agreed to raise Elena as his own, and for years he did. But he always knew. That part settled differently. Elena's gaze shifted slowly toward the window. Outside, rain continued to trace thin lines down the glass, each one merging into another before disappearing at the bottom frame. She watched them as if they were trying to form something legible, something she might finally understand if she stared long enough. Rose continued, softer now. There were moments Richard almost spoke. Moments at dinner tables, during school events, during birthdays where he looked at Elena with something heavy behind his eyes. But every time he chose silence. Not out of cruelty, but out of fear of breaking a structure that had already been built around her life. He told himself truth would hurt too much, that stability mattered more, that time would make things easier. Time did not make things easier. It only made them unquestioned. Elena exhaled slowly. It was the first time in hours her breathing felt intentional, like her body had remembered how to participate in its own survival. She looked down at her hands, as if expecting them to feel different. They did not. They still looked like her hands. Still familiar. Still hers. And yet something invisible had shifted in the ownership of her own history. Rose reached into her handbag again, this time more deliberately. She removed a folded envelope. The paper was old, edges softened by years of being handled, but never opened. The ink on the front had faded slightly, but Elena could still see her own name written in Rose's handwriting. Rose did not immediately explain. She simply placed it on the blanket between them. "This," she said quietly, "was written when you were a child." Elena did not touch it at first. Her eyes stayed fixed on the envelope as if it might move on its own. The hospital room felt unusually still now, as though even sound was waiting for permission to continue. Rose finally spoke again. She had written it years ago, when she first understood that Vanessa was carrying resentment she never released, and that Richard was choosing silence that would eventually become its own kind of inheritance. The letter contained what Rose believed should have been told earlier. Truth about Elena's father. Truth about the decisions that shaped her upbringing. Truth about love that was present in action, but absent in honesty. But she never gave it, because she believed, mistakenly, that people outgrow silence on their own. Elena slowly reached for the envelope. Her fingers hesitated before touching it, then finally lifted it with a carefulness that did not match her exhaustion. The paper felt lighter than expected. Fragile. Almost ordinary for something that held so much weight. She opened it. The first line was simple. No apology could undo what time had already built. Her eyes moved across the page slowly. Rose's handwriting remained steady throughout, but the words inside it carried a different kind of weight. Not dramatic, not loud, just accumulated truth. Details of Vanessa's early years. The pregnancy, the man who left, the decision not to tell Elena everything, the choice to preserve a version of stability that required omission to survive. At one point, Elena stopped reading. Her thumb remained on the edge of the paper, holding it in place, but her eyes drifted slightly out of focus. The hospital room came back into view around her in fragments. The curtains slightly open, the four stand near. The next morning arrived without ceremony. Hospital mornings never announced themselves with anything meaningful. They arrived through softened light behind blinds, the distant sound of carts rolling across polished floors, and the slow return of routines that do not care what was discovered the night before. Elena woke to the steady beep of machines in the hallway and the faint stiffness in her body that comes after sleeping in a place designed for recovery, not comfort. Rose was still there. She had fallen asleep sitting upright in the chair beside the bed, one hand resting loosely on the armrest, the other still near her handbag as if she had refused to fully let go of responsibility even in rest. Her breathing was slow, slightly uneven, the kind that comes with age and long days that begin before sunrise. A thin hospital blanket had been placed over her shoulders at some point during the night, though neither of them had noticed who had done it. Elena watched her for a long time, not crying, not moving, just observing the stillness of someone who had chosen to stay. There was something different about Rose now, even in sleep. Not physically different, but revealed, as if the weight of truth she had carried for years had finally loosened its grip, leaving behind a quieter version of herself. Elena slowly turned her head toward the window. Morning light filtered through in pale layers, touching the glass in a way that made the raindrops from the night before look like faint scars. The city outside was already moving. Distant traffic. People beginning days that would not pause for anyone's emotional restructuring. Inside the room, time felt suspended. A nurse entered quietly to check vitals. She spoke gently, avoiding unnecessary noise. Her hands were efficient, practiced, careful. She adjusted the monitor, recorded numbers, glanced at Elena with brief professional reassurance that everything was stable. Then she left again, closing the door softly behind her. Stability. The word echoed differently now. Elena had always associated stability with safety, with predictability, with being able to plan tomorrow based on today. But now stability felt more like structure built around silence. Something that holds everything in place without asking whether what it holds is true. Rose stirred eventually, not abruptly, just slowly opening her eyes as if returning from somewhere deeper than sleep. She blinked a few times, adjusting to the light, then turned her head toward Elena. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was no need. The conversation from the night before still existed between them, unchanged, unfinished, but no longer urgent in the same way. Rose sat up carefully, adjusting her cardigan over her shoulders. Her first words were simple. "Did you sleep?" Elena hesitated, then nodded, not because it was entirely true, but because language sometimes becomes softer than honesty when people are still learning how to exist after emotional rupture. Rose reached into her handbag again, as she often did when she needed grounding. This time she pulled out a small folded photograph. Its edges were worn, slightly bent from being handled too many times over the years. She placed it on the blanket between them without explanation. Elena looked down at it. A younger Vanessa stood in the image. Not the version Elena knew. Not the controlled woman with pressed clothes and measured expressions. This Vanessa looked uncertain. 18 or 19 at most. There was something unguarded in her face that did not yet know how to become defensive. Beside her stood a man Elena had never seen before. He was smiling, arm loosely around Vanessa's shoulder, unaware of how completely he would disappear from the story that followed. Elena picked up the photograph slowly. Her thumb traced the edge. There was something unsettling about seeing beginnings that no longer had outcomes attached to them. It made life feel less like a straight line and more like a series of decisions that quietly erase alternate versions of who people could have become. Rose spoke softly. "He was not unkind," she said. But he was not prepared for what he asked her to carry alone. Elena did not respond. The photograph remained in her hand longer than expected. Some truths do not create new understanding immediately. They create distance first. Distance between who you thought people were and who they were before they learned how to survive their own consequences. Later that morning, Vanessa arrived. There was no dramatic entrance. No visible tension at first glance. She walked in wearing a structured coat, hair carefully arranged, posture composed in the way she always maintained when entering spaces that required emotional control. She carried a bag in one hand and a small container of fruit in the other, the kind of offering that suggests effort without vulnerability. She paused when she saw Rose still there. A brief flicker crossed her face. Not surprise. Recognition. Then she turned her attention to Elena. "How are you feeling?" she asked. The question was correct. The tone was rehearsed. Elena studied her mother for a moment before answering. There was something unfamiliar now in the space between them. Not hatred, not anger. Something more precise. Clarity without softness. "I know," Elena said quietly. 2 words. Not loud enough to create conflict, but heavy enough to change the temperature of the room. Vanessa did not immediately respond. Her hand tightened slightly around her bag strap. Her eyes moved briefly toward Rose, then back to Elena. For the first time, her composure showed a small fracture at the edge of her control. "Know what?" she asked. Elena did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "I know why you never looked at me like I belonged to you," she said. "I know what you lost before I was born. I know what you never said out loud." The silence that followed was not empty. It was crowded, with everything that had been avoided for years. Rose stood slowly, sensing what this moment would become if it stayed uncontained. She placed her handbag on her shoulder, adjusting it with careful hands. She looked at both of them once, as if memorizing the space between them, then stepped toward the door. Before leaving, she paused, not to intervene, but to leave something behind. "Some truths," Rose said quietly, "do not arrive to destroy families. They arrive to reveal what was already broken." Then she left the room. The door closed softly behind her. Vanessa remained standing. For a long time, neither she nor Elena moved. Outside the window, morning light had fully arrived now. Brighter, less forgiving. It revealed every detail of the room with clarity that felt almost uncomfortable. Vanessa finally spoke again. Her voice was lower now, less controlled. "I did what I could," she said. Elena looked at her, and for the first time, there was no attempt to translate pain into understanding. "No," Elena replied. "You did what was easiest to survive." The words were not an attack. They were a correction. And something in Vanessa's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough to suggest she understood the difference. The hospital room did not erupt. Nothing dramatic happened. There was no shouting, no collapse, only the quiet recognition that some relationships do not end in conflict. They end in understanding that arrives too late to change what they were. Elena turned her gaze toward the window again. Outside, the city continued as if nothing inside the room had shifted. But inside, something irreversible had begun. Not an ending. Not yet. But the beginning of separation between a past that explained everything and a future that would no longer ask permission to exist. Elena was discharged 2 days later. Hospitals rarely feel like endings when you leave them. They feel like interruptions. Like life has been paused mid-sentence, and you are expected to continue speaking as if nothing inside you has changed. She walked out with a small paper bag containing medication, a printed discharge summary, and instructions she read twice, but only partially absorbed. The air outside felt sharper than she remembered. Not cleaner, just more demanding. Rose insisted on taking her home. The car ride was quiet at first. Rose kept both hands on the steering wheel, driving carefully through traffic that moved with indifferent rhythm. Elena sat in the passenger seat, staring at passing storefronts, blinking slowly as if trying to adjust to a world that no longer matched her internal tempo. The city looked normal. That was the unsettling part. Nothing outside reflected what had happened inside her. At one point, Rose spoke without turning her head. "You don't have to decide everything at once," she said. "Just don't go back to pretending nothing changed." Elena did not answer immediately. Her fingers rested loosely in her lap, tracing invisible lines on the fabric of her hospital wristband. She had not removed it yet. Something about it felt like proof that what happened was real, even if everything else tried to soften it into memory. When they arrived at Rose's house, the jasmine near the gate had grown thicker than Elena remembered. The scent filled the air as soon as she stepped out of the car. It carried something familiar, but also unfamiliar in how unchanged it was. That was what struck her most in the days that followed. The way some places continue existing as if people do not collapse inside hospitals or learn truths that rearrange their understanding of family. Inside the house, nothing had changed. The same chipped teacups, the same radio near the window, the same unfinished crossword on the table. But now everything felt quieter, as if the house itself was aware that one of its steady occupants would no longer return in the same way. Rose prepared tea without asking. She moved through the kitchen slowly, not out of weakness, but out of attentiveness. Every action felt deliberate, as though she understood that Elena's world had shifted and needed gentleness in response, not urgency. Elena sat at the kitchen table. The same table where she had once turned spoons in tea she never drank. The same table where warnings had been spoken and ignored. Now it felt different under her hands, like an object that had witnessed too much to remain ordinary. Days passed without dramatic events. There were no sudden reconciliations, no emotional breakthroughs that resolved everything neatly. Instead, there was silence. The kind of silence that is no longer empty, but processing. Elena stopped checking her work emails after the third day. The first time she tried, her fingers froze above the keyboard. The notification sounds felt distant, almost irrelevant. She closed the laptop and left it untouched on the table for hours. Later, she would realize that moment was the beginning of something larger than recovery. It was the beginning of detachment. Not from responsibility, from identity. At work, messages accumulated. Concerned colleagues. HR check-ins. A short note from her manager expressing hope she would recover quickly and return when ready. The words felt polite, structured, distant, like they belonged to someone else's life. Elena did not respond immediately. She placed her phone face down and walked into the garden instead. Rose found her there later, sitting on the edge of the stone steps, watching wind move through the jasmine leaves. There was no urgency in Rose's presence. She simply sat beside her, folding her hands in her lap, allowing silence to exist without trying to correct it. After a while, Elena spoke. I don't think I can go back there, she said. Rose did not ask where there meant. She understood. Some sentences do not need clarification when they are spoken from exhaustion. You don't have to, Rose replied. That simplicity unsettled Elena more than advice would have. She had spent so many years believing that every decision required justification, that leaving something meant failing at it, that stopping meant losing. But Rose spoke as if life allowed exits without punishment. Vanessa did not visit immediately. When she did, it was unannounced. She arrived one afternoon carrying a small envelope and the same controlled expression she wore in every situation that required emotional discipline. She did not step inside at first. She stood near the doorway, as if uncertain whether she still had the right to enter spaces that now felt emotionally unfamiliar. Elena saw her from the window before opening the door. For a moment, neither moved. Then Elena opened it. There was no greeting, no immediate confrontation, only awareness. Vanessa held out the envelope. I thought you should have this, she said. Inside was a document. Old, official, related to Elena's birth records. It confirmed what had already been spoken in the hospital room, but seeing it in paper form made it final in a different way. Less emotional, more structural. Elena held it for a long time. Then she asked something she had not planned to ask. Did you ever regret keeping it from me? Vanessa's jaw tightened slightly. A subtle shift in posture. Not defensive exactly. More like someone standing on ground that no longer feels stable. I did what I thought was necessary, she said. Elena nodded slowly. That answer no longer carried weight. Not because it was untrue, but because truth without accountability eventually becomes just explanation. Vanessa looked at her for a moment longer, then stepped back slightly. I didn't know how to raise you without, she began. She stopped, because whatever came next would not repair anything. And she knew it. For the first time, her voice lowered. I loved you, she said. Elena looked at her mother for a long moment. Not searching for emotion. Not searching for proof. Just observing the limits of what that sentence could still mean. I know, Elena replied quietly. And somehow, that was more final than anger would have been. Vanessa left without another word. The door closed gently behind her. No impact. No sound that marked ending. Just absence returning to its familiar place. Weeks passed. Then months. Elena did not return to her previous job. Instead, she resigned quietly. No long explanation. No dramatic farewell. Just a short message stating she needed time to recover fully. She expected guilt. It came briefly, then faded. What remained was relief she had not realized she was allowed to feel. She began walking daily. Long walks through streets she had passed for years without seeing. She noticed things she had never noticed before. A bookstore she had always rushed past. A small cafe where people lingered instead of scrolling. A park bench with peeling paint where an elderly man fed birds at the same time every afternoon. Life did not change dramatically, but attention did. Attention became the first form of healing. One evening, Rose's health declined unexpectedly. It was not sudden in a dramatic sense. It was the kind of decline that arrives gently but decisively, like a door closing slowly rather than slamming. Elena sat beside her hospital bed again, this time not as patient, but as presence. Rose looked smaller than before, but still steady, still aware. Her hand rested loosely in Elena's. There was no long conversation that night, only presence. At some point, Rose spoke softly. You're not lost anymore, she said. Elena shook her head slightly. I don't feel found either, she replied. Rose smiled faintly. That's because you're no longer where you used to be, she said. Those were her last clear words that night. Not a farewell, not a lesson, just recognition. Rose passed peacefully 2 days later. There was no dramatic moment, no final speech, just stillness that arrived like rest after a long journey. At the funeral, Elena stood beside Vanessa and Richard. Not between them, just near. No one spoke much. There were too many things that no longer needed language. After everyone left, Elena stayed behind at the small yellow house. The jasmine near the gate was in full bloom. She stood in the kitchen for a long time, looking at the table where so much had been revealed. Then she placed her hand lightly on its surface. Not as memory, not as grief, but as acknowledgement. That night, she wrote a single sentence in her notebook. Not about forgiveness, not about pain, but about direction. I will no longer confuse being loved with being chosen late. She closed the notebook, and for the first time, it stayed closed without pulling her back. Some stories do not end with reconciliation. They end with clarity. And clarity, though quiet, changes everything that comes after it. Elena did not wake up one morning and feel healed. Nothing about her life transformed in a clean, cinematic way. There was no sudden brightness in her thoughts, no dramatic forgiveness that made everything feel lighter. Instead, healing arrived in smaller, less noticeable ways, through repetition, through distance, through the slow removal of what once felt normal. She began noticing mornings again, not as obligations, but as time that simply existed. She would sit by the window in Rose's house with a cup of tea she sometimes forgot to finish. The steam would rise, curl, disappear. Outside, the jasmine kept growing, indifferent to grief, indifferent to understanding. Life continued its ordinary rhythm, which slowly began to feel less like insult and more like permission. There were days when Vanessa called. Elena did not always answer. At first, that silence felt sharp, like disobedience. Her hand would hover over the phone, fingers tense, heart reacting before her mind could decide. But each time she did not pick up, nothing collapsed. No punishment arrived. No consequence followed. Only quiet. And slowly, that quiet stopped feeling dangerous. It started feeling like space. Richard wrote once. A short message. No explanation. No attempt to reopen the past. Just a simple acknowledgement that he hoped she was well, and that he understood if she did not want to respond. Elena read it 3 times, then placed the phone face down. She did not reply immediately, and for the first time, that delay did not feel like avoidance. It felt like choice. Work did not call again after a while. Or perhaps they did, but Elena had stopped measuring her worth through urgency. Emails lost their emotional weight. Notifications became background noise rather than commands. The version of her life that once demanded constant response began to fade into something distant, like a story she had already finished reading. One afternoon, she returned to her own apartment for the first time since the collapse. It had been cleaned by Rose weeks earlier, but nothing inside felt familiar in the same way. The furniture was unchanged. The kitchen still held the same quiet appliances. The bed was still neatly made, but the meaning attached to those objects had shifted. She stood in the doorway for a long time without moving. A coat still hung on the back of a chair. A mug sat beside the sink. A notebook lay half open on the table with a pen resting diagonally across the page. Everything looked like a life paused mid-sentence. She walked slowly through each room, not searching, not avoiding, just observing what remained when urgency was removed. At some point, she opened the window. Air moved through the space, shifting curtains slightly. It was a small thing, but it changed the room more than rearranging furniture ever could. The silence inside no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like something she could inhabit without performing inside it. That evening, Rose's absence became more present than her presence had ever been. Not in a painful way, in a grounding way. Elena found herself remembering things she had once overlooked. The way Rose listened without interrupting. The way she never tried to fix emotions she did not fully understand. The way she simply stayed near pain without needing to define it. Presence, Elena realized, was not dramatic. It was consistent. Days turned into weeks. Elena began volunteering at a community center not far from Rose's neighborhood. Nothing structured at first, just helping with small tasks. Preparing tea for visitors. Organizing books. Sitting with people who did not always need answers, only company. There was an elderly woman who came every Thursday and never spoke much. She would sit in the same chair near the window and watch people move through the room. One day, she looked at Elena and said quietly, "It's strange how silence can feel different depending on who is sitting with you." Elena understood that sentence more deeply than she expected, because she had lived both kinds of silence. The kind that isolates, and the kind that holds. One evening, Elena returned to Rose's kitchen and sat at the same table where so many truths had once been revealed. The light outside was soft, turning everything into muted gold. She placed her hands flat on the wood surface and allowed herself to simply sit without needing to resolve anything. For the first time, she thought about her mother without immediate tension. Not forgiveness, not resentment, just understanding the shape of a life that had been carrying its own unresolved beginnings for decades. Vanessa had not been born distant. She had become distant, and Elena had spent most of her life living inside the consequences of something she did not start. That realization did not excuse anything, but it removed confusion. And sometimes clarity is what pain becomes when it finally stops asking to be justified. Months later, Vanessa visited again. This time, she did not bring documents or explanations. She simply stood at the gate for a long time before knocking. When Elena opened the door, neither of them spoke immediately. There was no performance in Vanessa's posture now. No controlled composure. Just a woman standing slightly less certain of how to exist in a space where authority no longer applied. "I don't know how to do this," Vanessa said finally. Her voice was quieter than before, less rehearsed. Elena studied her for a moment, not searching for apology, not searching for reversal, just recognition of reality. "Then don't try to do everything," Elena replied. "Just be honest when you can." Vanessa nodded slowly. It was not reconciliation, but it was also not denial. It was something more fragile, beginning without guarantee. After Vanessa left, Elena stood in the doorway for a long time. The air outside was still. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. A car passed slowly. Life continued in its ordinary rhythm, unconcerned with emotional resolution. Inside, Elena closed the door gently, not with finality, with awareness. That night, she wrote again in her notebook. Not about family, not about loss, but about something quieter. "I am no longer trying to return to who I was before I knew the truth." She paused, then added one final line beneath it. "I am learning how to stay with who I am after it." She closed the notebook. This time, she did not reopen it. And in that silence, there was no longer collapse waiting to happen, only continuation. Elena's life did not suddenly become easy after that. It became honest. And honesty, in the beginning, often feels heavier than confusion because it removes the comfort of misunderstanding. There were mornings when she still woke up with a tightness in her chest, reaching instinctively for problems that no longer required solving. The body, she learned, remembers old emergencies longer than the mind does. Some days, she still felt the urge to perform her way back into worthiness. She would catch herself mid-thought, straightening imaginary schedules, mentally organizing tasks, preparing for expectations that no longer existed in the same form. Then she would pause, place her hand on the kitchen counter, and simply breathe until the habit passed through her instead of controlling her. Rose's absence remained in the house in subtle ways. A cup left in a specific cabinet position that Elena never moved. A chair near the window that she sometimes sat in without realizing. A small knitted cloth on the kitchen table that she never had the heart to replace. Grief, she realized, was not a moment. It was a rearrangement of presence. And it did not end. It softened into the background of daily life, like light behind curtains. Vanessa changed too, but not in ways that could be measured quickly. She stopped arriving with explanations. She stopped defending every sentence. Sometimes she would sit in silence during visits, hands folded tightly in her lap, as if learning a new language she had avoided all her life. There were no dramatic apologies, no sudden emotional breakthroughs, just small pauses where defensiveness used to be. Richard, too, became quieter in a different way, not withdrawn, but present in a more careful sense. He would bring simple things, groceries left at the door, short handwritten notes, sometimes nothing more than a call that lasted less than 2 minutes. He did not try to rebuild the past. He only tried to remain consistent in the present, as if finally understanding that presence is not proven through intensity, but through continuity. Elena did not rush any of it. She had learned what happens when emotional speed replaces emotional understanding. So she allowed time to move without forcing it to mean anything before it was ready. One evening, she returned to Rose's garden alone. The jasmine had grown even fuller, spilling slightly over the fence now, as if it no longer recognized boundaries. The air carried its scent in waves, soft, persistent, familiar in a way that no longer belonged only to memory. She sat on the stone steps for a long time, not thinking in sentences, just allowing thoughts to arrive and leave without holding them. At some point, she noticed how quiet she had become inside herself. Not empty, just no longer constantly filled with explanation. That was when she understood something Rose had once said, but she had only partially grasped then. Some truths do not arrive to destroy a life. They arrive to remove the illusion of the one you were trying to survive inside. Elena closed her eyes. For the first time, the memory of the hospital did not feel like a fracture point. It felt like a threshold. Not where everything ended, but where something irreversible began. A few weeks later, she received a letter from Vanessa. Not an email, not a message, a handwritten letter. The handwriting was slightly uneven, as if written in more than one sitting. There were corrections in the margins, sentences that stopped and restarted. It did not attempt to explain everything. It did not attempt to fix the past. It simply said what was possible to say now. That she had not known how to love without control. That she had mistaken protection for distance. That she had believed silence would keep things stable, when in truth it only delayed understanding. There was no request at the end, only acknowledgement. Elena read it slowly, then placed it on the table beside Rose's old notebook. She did not respond immediately. And this time, that choice felt different again. Not like avoidance, not like fear, but like understanding that some conversations are no longer about resolution. They are about recognition. Later that evening, she walked through the house with the window open. The air moved gently through the rooms. Curtains shifted slightly. Light changed as the sun lowered. She stopped near the kitchen table where so much of her emotional life had once been rewritten without her permission. And she realized something quietly stabilizing. The table had not changed. The room had not changed. The past had not changed. But she had. And that was no longer something she needed permission to survive. Elena placed her hand lightly on the wood surface. Not as memory, not as grief, but as acknowledgement of continuity. Then she said, softly, not to anyone in particular, but to everything that had brought her here. I understand now that love is not proven by how long someone stays silent before they show up. It is proven by whether they show up at all. She withdrew her hand, and for the first time, the silence that followed did not feel like abandonment. It felt like space. Space she could finally live inside. Elena did not notice the exact moment her life stopped feeling like something she was surviving. It happened quietly, the way most lasting changes do. There was no announcement inside her body, no sudden clarity that arrived fully formed. Instead, there were small, almost unremarkable shifts. She began leaving her window open longer in the mornings. She stopped checking her phone immediately after waking. She allowed silence to exist in her home without filling it with noise just to prove she was still in control of something. Even grief, over time, changed its shape. It no longer arrived like a wave that knocked her off balance. It became something more like weather in the distance, visible, present, but no longer determining her direction. On certain afternoons, she would still think about the hospital ceiling, the sterile light, the rhythm of machines, the strange clarity that comes when a body is still being held together while everything emotional inside it is coming undone. But now, those memories did not pull her backward in the same way. They sat beside her instead, like something she had already passed through but still respected. Vanessa continued to write. Not often, not dramatically, but consistently enough that Elena no longer felt surprised when another letter appeared. Each one carried less explanation and more observation. I understand what you were trying to protect me from, she said. But I also understand now that protection without truth eventually becomes another form of distance. The wind moved slightly through the trees. No answer came, but she had not come for answers. She had come for recognition. On her way home, she passed a small cafe she had never noticed before. The windows were slightly fogged from inside warmth. People sat at small tables talking, reading, existing without urgency. She stopped for a moment outside, watching through the glass. Something inside her softened, not as emotion, but as acceptance of a life that no longer needed to be rebuilt from scratch. She went inside, ordered tea, sat near the window, did not check her phone, did not rush her thoughts. For a long time, she simply observed the way ordinary life continued around her without requiring her to prove anything to it. And for the first time, that felt enough. Later that evening, back in her home, she opened the window again. The air came in slowly. Light shifted across the room. She stood in the center of the space and realized something simple but final in its clarity. The story of her collapse had never truly been about the hospital. It had been about everything that came before it that she had been taught to normalize, and everything that came after it that she was finally learning to see. Elena closed her eyes briefly, then opened them, not as someone trying to return to who she was, not as someone trying to escape who she had been, but as someone finally aware that life was not asking her to choose between the two, only to continue. Elena's life continued in a way that no longer demanded explanation. There was no final moment where everything became perfect, no emotional closure that sealed the past neatly behind her. Instead, there was only continuity, days that arrived without warning, evenings that passed without urgency, and a growing ability to sit inside her own life without feeling like she had to escape from it. Some mornings still carried weight. She would wake up and feel the old instinct to mentally prepare for emotional emergencies that were no longer happening. Her hand would reach for her phone before she remembered there was nothing she needed to fix immediately. In those moments, she would pause, place her feet on the floor, and allow her breathing to slow until the body caught up with the present. Healing, she was learning, was not a destination. It was repetition without self-abandonment. Vanessa became a quieter presence in Elena's life, but not a distant one. Her letters no longer carried justification. They carried reflection. She began to describe memories differently, not to defend them, but to understand them. One letter spoke about a day Elena was 7 years old, sitting in the kitchen drawing shapes on the table with a pencil that had no eraser. Vanessa wrote about how she had almost told her the truth then, but stopped herself because she thought protecting childhood meant withholding complexity. Another letter simply said, "I thought silence would keep you safe from pain. I did not understand that silence only delays understanding. It does not remove it." Elena kept those letters in a small wooden box. Not hidden, not displayed, just kept. As part of what had happened, not as something she needed to resolve further. Richard remained steady in a different way. He did not try to redefine his role in Elena's life. He did not ask for emotional correction or reassurance. Instead, he began showing up in small, consistent ways. A phone call once a week that lasted no longer than necessary. A short message on days he thought she might be overwhelmed. A quiet acknowledgement of birthdays that did not require response. He had learned something too. That presence is not measured by intensity, but by reliability. And Elena, slowly, began to trust consistency again, not as certainty, but as something less fragile than explanation. There were still moments when the past returned unexpectedly, not as pain, but as memory without warning. She could be standing in a grocery aisle and suddenly remember the hospital ceiling, or walking through a quiet street and recall the exact sound of Rose's voice when she said, "You're not lost anymore." These memories no longer pulled her backward. They simply appeared, stayed briefly, and then moved on, like visitors who no longer needed to be entertained. One afternoon, Elena returned to Rose's garden after a long stretch of time away. The jasmine had grown even further, now spilling into places it had not reached before. It no longer felt like a maintained plant. It felt like something living fully on its own terms. She stood near it for a long time before sitting down on the stone steps. The air was warm, but not heavy. The kind of warmth that does not demand attention, only presence. Elena closed her eyes, and for the first time, she did not try to organize her thoughts into meaning. She simply let them pass. When she opened her eyes again, she noticed how still she had become inside. Not numb, not detached, just no longer in conflict with her own experience. That was when she understood something quietly profound. The collapse that had once defined her story was never the end. It was the point where everything she had been carrying without awareness finally became visible enough to be set down. Not erased, not fixed, just seen. Later that evening, she wrote in her notebook again. But this time, the words came without struggle. "I used to think survival meant holding everything together. Now I understand it sometimes means learning what you were never meant to carry alone." She paused, looked at the page, then added one final line. "And letting it rest without turning it into your identity." She closed the notebook, left it on the table, and did not open it again. That night, the window stayed open longer than usual. The air moved gently through the room, carrying distant sounds of life continuing elsewhere. Elena sat by the window without trying to interpret anything. For the first time, she did not feel like someone recovering from a collapse. She felt like someone who had finally stopped standing inside it. And that difference, though quiet, was everything. Elena did not notice when the weight of the past stopped defining her mornings. There was no dramatic shift, no single morning where everything felt different. Instead, there were small absences she only recognized in hindsight. The absence of checking her phone with dread. The absence of rehearsing conversations in her head before they happened. the absence of expecting emotional consequences from simply existing. She began to understand that healing was not what arrived. It was what slowly stopped interrupting her. Her life developed a quieter rhythm. She woke up, made tea, and sometimes forgot it on the counter while she sat near the window. The tea would cool on its own, untouched, while light shifted across the floor in slow angles. There was something grounding in that. Unfinished tea, unforced time, a life that no longer required immediate resolution. Vanessa's presence remained, but it changed shape. Her letters became less about the past and more about what she was noticing in herself. She wrote about silence differently now, not as something protective, but as something she was finally learning to listen within instead of using it as a shield. She admitted, in one letter, that she used to believe being strong meant never revealing confusion. Now she was beginning to understand that confusion, acknowledged honestly, is often the beginning of clarity. Elena kept those letters in the same wooden box. She no longer read them repeatedly. Once was enough. Richard continued in his quiet consistency. He never tried to rewrite what had happened. He simply remained present in ways that did not demand emotional performance. A message on a difficult day. A short call when weeks had passed without contact. A reminder of small, ordinary things that required no interpretation. Elena did not respond to everything, but she also did not withdraw completely. She was learning a new balance, not between people, but between presence and pressure. There were still days when memory arrived without invitation. A certain tone in a stranger's voice would briefly bring her back to the hospital room. A flicker of fluorescent light in a shop would remind her of sterile ceilings and waiting silence. But these moments no longer fractured her. They passed through her like weather moving across a landscape that no longer needed to defend itself. One evening, Elena found herself walking without destination. Her steps slowed naturally as she reached a familiar street she had once rushed through countless times. Now she noticed things she had previously overlooked. The uneven pattern of bricks on a wall, the sound of a distant radio through an open window, the way evening lights softened even the most ordinary buildings. She stopped near a small bridge. Water moved beneath it quietly, reflecting fragments of sky that were already shifting into dusk. She leaned lightly against the railing, not thinking in structured thoughts, just observing movement without needing meaning. For a long time, she stood there, not searching, not remembering, just existing without negotiation. And something subtle settled inside her. Not peace in the dramatic sense people often expect, but acceptance without resistance. That was when she realized something important had changed. Not the past, not the people, but her relationship to both. The story that once defined her, the collapse, the hospital, the absence of parents, the presence of a grandmother who carried truths too long alone, no longer sat at the center of her identity. It had become part of her history, not her definition. She returned home that evening and did not turn on all the lights immediately. She left the room partially dim, allowing the natural fading of daylight to complete its own transition. She moved through her space slowly, not because she was tired, but because urgency no longer lived inside her movements. She placed her keys down, removed her coat, sat for a moment without reaching for distraction. And in that stillness, she noticed something she had not noticed before. She was no longer waiting for life to begin after recovery. She was already inside it. Later, she opened her notebook, not to write a resolution, not to document pain, but simply to acknowledge continuity. She wrote, "There was a time I believed love was proven through how much pain you were willing to endure without leaving. Now I understand love also means not abandoning yourself in the process of staying." She paused, looked at the sentence, then closed the notebook without hesitation. Outside, the city continued its usual rhythm, unaware, unchanged, unbothered by internal transformation. Lights flickered on in distant windows. Conversations moved through walls. Life carried on without needing permission. Elena stood by her window for a long time, not reflecting, not analyzing, just present. And for the first time since everything began, she did not feel like someone recovering from a collapse. She felt like someone who had finally stopped organizing her life around what broke her, and started living from what remained. Elena did not realize at first that she had stopped flinching at her own memories. It happened in small, almost invisible moments. A conversation would drift toward family, and instead of her body tightening in anticipation, she would simply listen. A photograph would appear on a screen, and instead of immediate emotional recoil, there would be recognition without collapse. Even her breathing had changed, less guarded, less prepared for impact. Nothing external announced this shift. It simply became harder to find urgency where it once lived. Rose's absence remained part of Elena's days, but not as an open wound. It had become something closer to a foundation, something that no longer hurt to stand on, even if it was built from absence. In quiet moments, Elena would still think of her sitting by the kitchen window, hands folded, listening more than speaking. And in those memories, there was no longer only grief. There was instruction, presence without interference, love without demand. Vanessa's letters continued, though less frequently now. Each one carried less explanation and more observation. She wrote about noticing how often she used silence as protection instead of communication. She wrote about the first time she realized she had repeated patterns she once promised herself she would never repeat. She wrote about how difficult it was to sit with her own discomfort without immediately trying to control its outcome. Elena did not respond every time, but she also did not close the door. The relationship no longer existed in extremes. It existed in distance that had stopped pretending to be absence. Richard's presence remained steady in its simplicity. He did not attempt to redefine his role. He did not overcorrect the past. He simply continued showing up in predictable ways that required no emotional negotiation. A message, a call, a short note left without expectation of reply. And slowly, Elena began to trust what did not demand explanation. One afternoon, Elena found herself returning to the hospital district. Not intentionally at first. Her steps simply led her there. The streets felt unchanged, but she was no longer the same person walking them. The building stood in the same place, its windows reflecting light in the same clinical way, but it no longer held power over her body. She stopped across the street. Did not go inside. There was no need. What had happened there was no longer located in the building. It was located in her understanding of what she had survived. She stood there for a long time. People passed her without noticing anything unusual. Cars moved through intersections. A distant announcement echoed from a bus stop. Life continued in its ordinary rhythm, indifferent to personal history. And for the first time, Elena understood something deeply grounding. The moment that once defined her collapse had stopped defining her direction. It had become reference, not residence. She turned away and walked slowly back toward the main road. Each step felt less like leaving something behind and more like moving within something she now understood differently. That evening, she visited Vanessa. There was no announcement. No emotional preparation, just a quiet decision to go. Vanessa opened the door with a moment of hesitation that softened when she saw her daughter standing there. No words were exchanged immediately. The space between them held its own history, but it no longer demanded resolution before entry. They sat in the living room. Tea was made, but not rushed. At some point, Vanessa spoke first. "I still think about what I should have done differently," she said quietly, hands wrapped around the cup without drinking. Elena looked at her for a long moment, not searching for correction, not searching for apology, just acknowledging the honesty in the sentence. "You don't have to fix it in your mind anymore," Elena said. "You just have to not repeat it." Vanessa nodded slowly, and something in her posture loosened, not fully, not permanently, but enough to show that understanding had finally become more important than defense. Silence followed, but it was no longer the kind of silence that erased connection. It was the kind that allowed it to exist without performance. Later that night, Elena walked home alone. The streets were quieter now, softened by evening light. She noticed how familiar everything felt and how differently she was experiencing that familiarity. The same roads, the same buildings, but no longer the same internal reaction. When she reached her apartment, she did not immediately turn on the lights. She stood in the doorway for a moment, letting the darkness inside meet the fading light behind her. And she understood something simple, but complete. The collapse had never been the end of her story. It had been the removal of everything she had mistaken for stability. What remained was not emptiness. It was clarity that no longer required pain to justify its existence. She stepped inside, closed the door gently behind her. And in that moment, nothing dramatic changed in the room, but something irreversible had already changed in her understanding of it. Elena no longer saw her life as something that had collapsed in a hospital room. She saw it as something that had been revealed there. Not broken, not lost, but stripped of everything that was never meant to define it in the first place. Some stories do not end when the truth arrives. They end when the person finally stops organizing their life around avoiding it. And what remains after that is not resolution. It is awareness that no longer needs permission to exist. Because sometimes the deepest healing is not becoming who you were before everything fell apart. It is finally accepting that you never needed to be that person again.